Hello, ambassadors. God is in the repair business. We've spent the last 5 weeks, and today will be our 6th, looking at repairs by God. The idea is expressed in the many images in Scripture about God as a potter, God working with pottery. Paul's reference in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 to 10, where he says, "We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies." We started the series by looking at a Japanese process of pottery repair called kintsugi. The way they repair broken pottery, instead of using super glue and trying to hide the fracture, they actually use a lacquer that's dusted with powdered gold that leaves seams of gold where the fractures were, calling attention to the cracks in the ceramic wares. Kintsugi at one and the same time both highlights the fractures and makes them beautiful. And at the same time, it also makes the vessel far more valuable than it ever was before. Kintsugi is a good description of how God takes flawed, broken humans and repairs them with His own gold so that we become stronger, more usable, and more valuable than ever before. We've looked at 4 broken people, counting today, in a series of 6 lessons to see how God made something far more beautiful and valuable when He put the broken pieces of their lives back together. Our first lesson was a look at Peter that I called Jesus Gives Do-Overs, as we considered that his 3 denials were replaced by 3 affirmations and by 3 commissions by Jesus to tend His sheep, feed His sheep. Jesus took the man who failed Him and gave him responsibility. Then we looked at Moses in a lesson I called Objections Overruled, and saw how when Moses didn't think he was worthy of being used by God, didn't think he had what it took anymore, God said, "Now you've got you where I want you. Now I can use you because you know the strength doesn't come from you." Then we took 3 looks at Paul. We looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and asked the question, where is God when it hurts? And then 3 weeks ago, we looked at 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 to 7, and considered how we are comforted in our difficulties so that we can comfort others. Last week, we looked at one of my all-time favorite texts in 2 Corinthians 5, 11 to 21, as we considered that Christ has called us to be His ambassadors. Today, we're looking at an unlikely repair job done by Jesus in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. In a lesson I call The Demoniac, Right Here, Right Now. Let's begin with our text. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, and let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the man, demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. The story of Mark 5 actually begins back in Mark chapter 4. In Mark 4 verse 1 we read that Jesus began to teach by the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him so that he got into a boat and sat on it in the sea. And the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. When we go to Israel next year, we'll visit, among other places, the ruins of the town of Capernaum, where Jesus focused his ministry in Galilee. We'll see the ruins of an ancient synagogue, which is built on top of the very synagogue where Jesus preached. In fact, we'll see the basalt stones that remain from the wall of Jesus' synagogue in Capernaum. Well, about half a mile south of Capernaum is a natural cove on the Sea of Galilee that abuts a natural amphitheater. That cove is called Sower's Cove, or the Bay of Parables, because it's believed that Jesus gave the parables from a fishing boat in that cove. Even conversational voices in the cove carry over the water and up that amphitheater today, so it's a good bet that that cove is the site of the parables in Mark 4. Well, in Mark 4:35, after Jesus had been teaching, we read this: "On that day when evening had come, he said to them," his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." Now the rest of Mark 4 tells about a storm that arose on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus calming the storm with those words, "Peace, be still." So across from Capernaum, which is on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, is a ruin known in the Bible times as Gergesa. Modern days it's called Cursi, where Jesus apparently performed the miracle we're talking about today. 3 of the 4 Gospels record the miracle of the healing of the demoniac and of the pigs rushing into the sea, but there's a vexing question about where exactly this took place. Some translations say the Gergesenes, some say the Gadarenes, some say the Gerasenes. And all 3 of those descriptions can be found among the Greek manuscripts of the Gospels. Where did it take place? Well, in that region, there are 3 possibilities that are mentioned just by the use of those names. There is Gadara, which is in modern days called Qes. It's about 5 miles from the Sea of Galilee, so it couldn't have been the place where the miracle took place. So the description Gadarenes is definitely not correct. Then there's Gerasa. Modern day it's called Jerash. It is situated considerably south of the Sea of Galilee, about 37 miles, so it cannot be the site of the miracle. But right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee is Gergesa. Today it's called Cursi, and it's situated on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it's the only spot on that shore with a steep bank overlooking the sea that we have described in Mark 5:13. The ancient church historian Eusebius identified this as the site of the miracle. And if you visit there, there's the remains of a Byzantine monastery that's dated back to the 6th century that commemorates this healing. Well, based upon all the evidence, it appears that probably the earliest texts said Gergesenes, but that because scribes in other locations who were not familiar with the geography of the locations in Israel, when they took those texts and copied them, somehow corrupted them to say either Gerasenes or Gadarenes. But Gergesa or Cursi is where it certainly happened. This is an aerial view of Cursi today. And if you look close, you'll see a steep drop-off leading toward the lake. I want to share with you a 4.5-minute video clip that I took. It's a segment from a DVD, Where Jesus Walked. It's a DVD produced by the Biblical Archaeology Society and hosted by Herschel Shanks, who died at the age of 90 just earlier this year in February. But I think you'll find this a very fascinating video.
Often, when archaeologists are searching for a particular site mentioned by historians or in the Bible, they have no direct signposts to follow, so they must rely on circumstantial evidence, making inferences based on more recent, but still ancient traditions. One example is the ancient site of Gergesa, now called Kursi, on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. In the 3rd century, church fathers seeking the location of the events described in the Bible believed that this was the site of the swine miracle, when Jesus supposedly drove a legion of demons out of a possessed man and into a herd of pigs. They even erected a church and monument to memorialize the event. I've always been curious about the swine. After all, pigs aren't kosher. So I went there with Vasilius Tseferis, who excavated the site.
Jesus was in Capernaum with his disciples, and he decided to go to the other side, to the eastern side of the lake. So they got a boat, and at the middle of the lake there was a storm. And such storms actually happen in the lake in the winter time. So they came to the land of the Gergesenes, as one of the Gospels says. Another Gospel says they came to the land of the Gadarenes, and a third Gospel says to the land of the Gerasenes. So, and over there, just beyond the limits of the city, Jesus met with a demoniac, and one of the Gospels says there were 2 demoniacs, and he healed him because he was occupied by 1,000 demons. The demons were just put into a herd of pigs, and the pigs were drawn into the lake. The church fathers, already from the 3rd century, started to argue about it, and they say Gadara cannot be because Gadara is far in the south. Gerasa, of course, cannot come into account because it is in Arabia. So the name Gergesim or Gergesenes must be the real name. And as a matter of fact, we know that in this place there was a site which was called Kursi, which is very close to the Gergesenes, Gergesa. And actually the site of Kursi, Tel Kursi, is just 300 meters from here. So already from the 1st century, the Christians identified this place as the place of the miracle. And in the late 4th and 5th centuries, they put up a church, a beautiful church, as you can see here.
That's where we're standing.
Exactly, and a monastery. And on the slope, just opposite the monastery, they built a small chapel. The chapel is half built into a cave, into a natural cave, and half on an open space. And that fits the story of the gospel, which says that the demoniac was living in tombs and in caves outside the city. And in front of the chapel, they left a natural rock standing about 4 meters. You can see it.
Does the geography, does the lay of the land fit the...
Exactly, very exactly. I mean, we are just opposite Capernaum. Just on the other side is Capernaum. So Jesus crossed just from Capernaum and came to the other side. The city was on the shores of the lake, and you can still today you can see the mound, the tail of Tel Kursi, and there was also a harbor and some fishing installations. This is the only case in which Jesus was on the eastern side of the lake, because all his mission and his ministry was actually on the western side, in which all the Jewish settlements were, while in the eastern side were the lands which occupied by the Greeks, by the city of Hippos, the Gadara in the south, and probably Gergesa also, who was some Hellenized tribe.
And they were not Jewish?
They were not Jewish. There were no Jews here in this part. No Jews. That's why, I mean, you find the pigs here, and that's why you have only one time in which Jesus came to this part of the lake.
Well, let's take a look at the questions. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to think about them a little bit. Question 1. Imagine you're a disciple arriving on the scene with Jesus. What do you see, hear, smell, touch? How would you have reacted to the scene? Well, as we just saw in that video clip, this would be unfamiliar territory for the disciples. They're Jewish fishermen from Capernaum on the northwest shore of the lake. They really wouldn't be accustomed to going across the lake to the other side because that's not where they conducted their business. And so there are lots of reasons for them not to go across the lake. The eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, which is really just a big lake, the eastern side was occupied by Gentiles, not Jews. That's the reason that you have a herd of swine there. They're animals that the Jews considered ceremonially unclean and therefore unfit to eat. They wouldn't associate with the Gentiles, they wouldn't associate with the swine, they wouldn't associate with the customs of the Gentiles on the eastern shore of the lake, because there were just a lot of practices that were foreign to them and offensive to them. So they wouldn't normally be going across the lake. It had to be an unusual thing for Jesus to say, let's go to the other side of the lake. Well, in chapter 5, verse 3, we find out that there's a fellow who's living in caves where the dead are buried. And the Greek text makes it really clear that this is the place where he customarily makes his home. Well, they've actually found archaeological evidence of very poor people living in caves that were also used as burial caves. Now, Mark's description of this story is the most detailed in any of the Gospels. And 3 times he mentions the tombs where the demoniac lived. They were cut out of rock or natural mountain caves. They were tombs, they were burial places, and all of those things were associated with the dead, and therefore they were unclean for the Jews. Here's a fellow who comes out, running out to them, and it's clear that he's been shackled, he's been chained repeatedly. Nobody was able to restrain him, nobody was able to subdue him. That Greek word subdue is the word that you use for subduing or taming a wild animal in James chapter 3, verse 7. Here's a fellow who seems to have supernatural strength. That's indicated by the fact that he's torn the chains apart, he smashed the shackles, and this guy's always crying out. The Greek text makes it clear. He's always crying out, and his shrieks echo among the tombs and on the mountains. He's a danger to himself, and he's a danger to others. Verse 5 says he cuts himself. Not just occasionally, he's constantly cutting himself. You see, the goal of demons is to destroy the person who's created in the image of God. This man's demonization is evident in his social isolation, his superhuman strength, and his self-destructive tendencies. So what would you have thought if you had been one of the disciples encountering this fellow? I imagine you'd want to get in the boat and go back home on the other side of the lake. I know I would have. Question 2. What do we know about this strange man? Well, notice verse 2. When Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Now, later on in verses 15 and 16, we're going to see him described by the Greek word daimonitzomai, which is translated from the noun daimonion, which means demon or evil spirit. And what that means is, the verb means literally to be demonized. And it refers to the activities of demons in harassing and oppressing and even possessing people. Well, this fellow was demonized in 2 ways. First, he was possessed by demons that caused him to engage in all kinds of antisocial behaviors that would terrify the people and certainly would have terrified you or me. But second, he was also demonized by the citizens of the area because of the antisocial behaviors he exhibited. Now, when you read that word daimonitzomai, it doesn't always refer to demon possession, but it always refers to demonic activity. And that's the case in Mark chapter 5. The fellow is described as having a legion of demons that Jesus cast into a herd of pigs. And just think about it. In order for there to be enough demons there To inhabit 2,000 pigs and run them into the sea implies an incredibly high demon possession, and that certainly explains the man's bizarre behavior and his astounding strength. The verb is used to describe the reality of the unseen world, the world of spirit beings. And in this miracle, we see Jesus' absolute power over demons, regardless of the evil they cause. Question 3. What did this man look like before and after his encounter with Jesus? I thought about this one for a while. Look at verses 3, 4, and 5. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the stones and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. So what have you got? You've got a fellow who's poor and isolated. He lives in tombs. Now that was not unusual for the same cave, especially in that region, to provide a place for burying the dead and for sheltering the living. In fact, very poor people often lived in caves in that territory. They've actually found in caves near Kersey that show evidence of both burials and occupations at the same time. So here's a fellow who's poor and isolated. In verse 4, we see the people are terrified of him, and they treat him cruelly. And so you read, they'd often bound him with shackles and chains, but he kept breaking the chains and he kept breaking the shackles, and no one had the strength to subdue him. So he'd often been chained. The villagers had chained him partly for their own protection. But this harsh treatment added to his humiliation. And then we see third that he's engaged in self-harm. Verse 5. The text says he's always crying out. He's always cutting himself with stones. You see, every word in this story emphasizes the man's pathetic condition, as well as the purpose of demonic possession, to torment and destroy the divine likeness in which we as people are created. Well, what do you see at the end of the story? Verses 14 to 17. The herdsman fled and told about this in the city and in the country, and the people came out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Notice, here's a fellow who had been running around like a wild man, because he was a wild man before, and now he's sitting. He's no longer attacking everyone who comes near. Where he'd been running around naked, now he's clothed. Where he had been engaged in ranting and self-harm, now he's in his right mind. All of the violent and self-harming antisocial behavior is gone. Question 4. Imagine you were casting this man in a movie. What actor comes to mind to play his part? I had to think about this one for a while, but not terribly long before I came up with my first choice. I don't think anybody could be a better example of this fellow than Jack Nicholson, who always seems to be playing a crazy person. But maybe there are some others. Maybe Al Pacino might do it. Or how about a fella who always seems to be shackled, and yet he can terrify people without moving a muscle? Anthony Hopkins. Or maybe Christopher Walken might be a good example. More recently, how about Joaquin Phoenix? There are all kinds of examples of people who play demented, crazy, terrifying people in movies. Question 5. How did the unclean spirit harm this man? Here's a picture of the hill that's today called Swine Hill, and it's a picture of a place where there are a lot of caves that show evidence of contemporaneous burials and habitations, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. Well, we read in Mark chapter 5, verses 3 to 5, he lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. Well, one thing we see here is what Satan can do to people. Satan is a thief. His ultimate purpose is to destroy. Think about what this man had lost. Because of Satan, this man had lost everything. He'd lost his home. He'd lost the fellowship of his family and friends. He'd lost his decency as he ran around the tombs naked. He'd lost his self-control and lived like wild animals, screaming, cutting himself, frightening the citizens. He'd lost his peace. He'd lost the purpose for living. And he would have remained in that plight if Jesus hadn't come through a storm to rescue him. Never underestimate the destructive power of Satan. He is our enemy, and he would destroy all of us if he could. Peter says he's like a roaring lion seeking to devour us. 1 Peter 5, verses 8 and 9. It's Satan who's at work in the lives of unbelievers, making them children of disobedience, as Paul says in Ephesians 2, 1 and 3. So this man in the Gergesene graveyard was an extreme example of what Satan can do to people. But what he reveals is enough to make us want to resist Satan and have nothing to do with him. Question 6. Legion. What is a legion? What does this teach us about the devil? Notice verses 7, 8, and 9. Crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." This is quite interesting. That description, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, the Son of the Most High God? I adjure you." Who uses the word adjure anyway? Adjure means implore you, beg you, ask you. I beg you by God, do not torment me. Well, that's an interesting expression. What have you to do with me? Literally in Greek, it is what to me and to you. It's an idiom. It's a phrase that is Semitic in origin, even though it made its way into colloquial Greek. The expression has two basic meanings. First, when a person was unjustly bothering another, the injured party could say, "What to me and to you?" And what that means is, what have I done to you that you should be treating me this way? But second, when someone was asked to get involved in a matter that he really didn't have any business in, he could say to the one asking him, "What to me and to you?" Meaning, that's your business. How am I involved? Well, these nuances were apparently expanded in Greek, but the basic notions of defensive hostility or indifference or disengagement are still present. And so the way you might translate this is, "What have I to do with you?" or "What have we in common?" or "Leave me alone," or "Never mind," or all of those ideas that express hostility between Jesus and the demons. So the Net Bible translates it this way: "Leave me alone." Now, notice though that even when he says "leave me alone," he identifies Jesus as the Son of the Most High God. Don't you think it's strange that a demon invokes God's name? "I implore you by God," in his demands of Jesus. In Matthew's account of this, in Matthew 8:29, this demon that possesses the man says, "Why have you come to torment us before the time?" In other words, they recognize that there's a time that judgment is coming, and there's a time they cannot escape that judgment, but it's too early. But then when Jesus says, "What is your name?" And notice that he says, the scripture says he kept saying to him, "Come out of the man." It's in what's called the imperfect tense. So what's going on here is a back and forth where Jesus says, "Come out of the man," and Satan and the demon is saying, "What? Leave me alone." And Jesus is saying, come out of the man, and Satan's saying, leave me alone. And that kind of dialogue is going back and forth until Jesus finally says, get out of that man now. But he asks first, what is your name? And the demon says, Legion. Literally, the word legion means thousands. It's a word that comes from Latin for a large group of soldiers. It indicates that this fella has a lot of demons possessing him, because a legion was the largest unit of the Roman army, and it consisted of at least 3,000 and up to, say, 6,000 soldiers. So here's a fellow who's possessed by many demons, which tells us that what's going on here is really a spiritual battle. Question 7. What is one application you can make from this story? How about this? Pigs don't walk on water. That's kind of facetious, but you see it in verses 11 and following. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs and let us enter them. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Well, I have several observations on this. For one thing, we have rebellion against God. In verse 7, the demon screams at Jesus, leave me alone. What do you want with me? It's a shriek of fear and defense and rebellion against God. You know, no one today would like to admit to being demon-possessed. But if you think about it, most of our society, like the demon, is screaming at God, screaming at the church, screaming at Christian values. What do you want out of me? Get out of my life. Leave me alone. When people reject Jesus Christ and his authority, they put themselves on the side of the demons, and they're headed in the same direction. Every person has to ask, will I choose autonomy and self-will leading to destruction, or will I choose Christ's loving leadership over my life, giving me forgiveness, healing from sin, cleansing, and true freedom? And the answer has eternal implications. A second thing I see is there's a spiritual war going on between Jesus and Satan. Mark often highlights the supernatural struggle between Jesus and Satan. The demon's goal was to control the humans they inhabited. Jesus' goal was to give people freedom from sin and freedom from Satan's control. The demons knew they had no power over Jesus, so they simply begged not to be sent out of the area, or as Luke puts it in Luke 8:31, into the abyss, and Jesus grants their request to enter into the herd of pigs, but ended their destructive work in people. Maybe Jesus let the demons destroy the pigs to demonstrate his own superiority over a very powerful yet destructive force. He could have sent them to hell, but he didn't, because the time for judgment had not yet come. In the end, the devil and his angels will be sent to the eternal fire. But then there's a third thing I see, and that is rejection by the people. After such a wonderful miracle of saving a man's life, why did the people want Jesus to leave the territory? Well, they were afraid. They were afraid of his supernatural power. They also may have been afraid that he would continue destroying their pigs, which were their livelihood. And they'd rather give up Jesus than lose their source of income and security. They were more concerned about the economic impact of losing their pigs than about the man who had been restored to sanity. Question 8. Jesus reveals God to us. What do we learn about God from this story? Well, what did Jesus Christ do for this man? First, he graciously came to him in love and even went through a storm to do it. Some people think that the storm itself may have been satanic in origin, since Jesus used the same words to calm the sea as he did to cast out demons back in Mark 1:25. In Mark 1:25, he told a demon, be silent. In Mark 4:39, he tells the storm, be still. Both of those words are translations of the same Greek word, themao, which means to muzzle. Whenever I see that, I think about Archie Bunker telling Edith, stifle yourself, Edith. Perhaps Satan was trying to destroy Jesus, or at least prevent him from coming to the man who needed him. But nothing could stop the Lord from coming to that graveyard and bringing deliverance to that man. Not only did Jesus come to him, but he spoke to him and permitted him to speak to him. The citizens of that area avoided the demoniac, but Jesus treated him with love and respect because he came, as he put it in Luke 19:10, to seek and save the lost. Now it's interesting to note that as the demons spoke through the man, they confessed what they really believe. You know, James says in James 2:19, demons believe and tremble. And so we've got these demons who acknowledge Jesus as the Son of the Most High God. But that kind of faith, that kind of belief, isn't going to save them. Demons believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he has authority over them. They believe in the reality of judgment and that one day they'll be cast into hell. We read that in Matthew 8:29. This is more than many people believe today, even religious people. And then we also see Satan tried to destroy this man, but Jesus came to deliver him. By the power of his word, he cast out the demons and set the man free. Demons even believe in prayer because they begged Jesus not to send them into the abyss, the place of torment, not to send them out of the area. They asked him, send us into the pigs. It's encouraging to note that the demons didn't know what Jesus planned to do. That suggests to me that Satan can know God's plans only if God reveals them. In fact, there is no evidence in Scripture that Satan can read the mind of a believer, let alone the mind of God. Question 9. Why didn't Jesus let this man follow him? Look at Mark 5, verses 18 to 20. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So Jesus tells this man to declare what the Lord has done for him, in contrast to his usual instructions. You recall elsewhere in the gospel where Jesus tells people over and over and over again, be silent, don't tell anybody. But here in Gentile territory, he allows more open discussion of his ministry, maybe suggesting that because there are not any Jews around to misunderstand him and misrepresent him and take what he does as a political thing to oppose, the Gentiles might actually be responsive to the message. So when Jesus says to him, go home to your family and friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, we read in verse 20, he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. Notice, the man couldn't separate what God had done for him from the one through whom God had done it. Tell how much the Lord has done for you, what mercy he has shown you. That's what Jesus said. And what the man does is he goes and tells how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. Well, what about this Decapolis? Have you ever given any thought to that? The Decapolis is a region, and you can see it on this map. It's basically that region in kind of a lavender color on the east side of the Jordan River. The word Decapolis literally means 10 cities, and it was a group of 10 significant Roman cities on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. According to Pliny the Elder, in the mid-1st century, the 10 cities were Scythopolis, which is actually a place that we will visit. In fact, it's the only one of the 10 cities that's on the west side of the Jordan River. The rest are all on the east. But we'll actually visit it. It's the ruins of a Roman city, and it's quite fascinating to see. But there is Scythopolis, there's Hippos, there's Gadara that we've already talked about. There's Raphana and Dion and Pella and Gerasa, another place we've talked about. There's Philadelphia, which is today called Amman, Jordan. There's Kanatha, and there's Damascus, the capital of Syria, which incidentally is the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Well, why did Jesus tell the man to tell others about what great things the Lord had done for him when he had told the other previous people that he's healed not to tell anyone? Well, apparently in the Gentile region, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for people to create problems for Jesus' mission as they did in the Jewish territory. And so, also, he's showing that his mission is not only to the Jews, but it's also to the Gentiles. I can't help but think that this is beginning to plant the seed in the minds of Peter, for example, who's going to be the first to take the message directly to Gentiles when he teaches and baptizes Cornelius and his household in Caesarea later on. So Jesus tells this man, this Gentile man, to go to this Gentile region and preach. And that's what he does. I like this quote by John Calvin. Though we are not tortured by the devil, yet he holds us as his slaves till the Son of God delivers us from his tyranny. Naked, torn, and disfigured, we wander about till he restores us to soundness of mind. Well, when that fellow goes into the Decapolis, people begin to respond. They marveled at his testimony, Mark tells us. His account of this miracle stressed Jesus' divine power and authority, and it tells how that message began to spread in the Decapolis. In his commentary on the Gospels, Robert Gulick says this: the story of the deliverance of a man becomes the story of the deliverance of a land. Question 10. I draw your attention to these 5 words. Go home to your friends. Why was God calling on him to go to his friends? What is the lesson for us? Well, this healed man so appreciated what Jesus had done for him that he wanted to go with Jesus and serve him. Now think about that. That means as a Gentile, he wanted to go back to the Jewish territory with Jesus and the disciples, a place where he would again be rejected because he's a Gentile. But instead, Jesus sends him home to bear witness to the Gentiles in that area. Now think about it. There are 3 questions that are asked, 3 requests that are made of Jesus in this particular story. There's the request of the demons. Don't send us out of the country. Let us go into the pigs. And Jesus allows it. Then there's the request of the citizens. Go away. Leave us alone. And Jesus does what they ask. But here comes this fellow who says, let me go with you, and Jesus says no. In other words, what he's saying to us is, before you go out to serve Jesus elsewhere, be sure you've served him faithfully at home. I hope you've enjoyed this study about repairs by God as I have. As we've gone through it, I've thought about a whole bunch of other people we could have talked about, and maybe we'll come back and do that sometime. But beginning next week, we're going to take a look at the kingdom of God. And we're going to begin with the kingdom promised in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. I look forward to seeing you then, whether we're back together on campus or whether we're still online. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen and amen.